everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Nick Herman. I'm the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator here at the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, filling in for the usual host for Coffee with a Codex, Porter. Now, today I'm showing you a manuscript from the first half of the 16th century. So let's get right into it, and I will be with you for the next 29 minutes showing you this beautiful processional manuscript from France from the first half of the 16th century. And I hope you can all hear me all right, and that you'll be able to hear the codex speak as I turn the page. So this item here, MS Codex 1229, was acquired by Penn Libraries around 2008, and has some earlier provenance that we'll talk about in a moment. But this, as you can see, is almost a pocket-sized volume, and it has a spine that's been repaired with some more modern, probably early 20th century, late 19th century inscriptions on the spine, Processional on vellum, MSS France 1535. And we'll talk a bit about that date of 1535 shortly. But I hope you can see from the overhead camera that this has a blind tooled cover of brown leather over boards, pretty typical for this period for the early 16th century. And I hope you can also see that the manuscript has remnants, of course, of clasps. Here are the attachments at the back, and the catches here that are missing, which is fairly typical also for manuscripts like this. And you can see that the absence of the clasps over time has made the profile of the book become a little bit V-shaped, and that's what happens as well as vellum or as parchment expands and becomes more three-dimensional as if a book is not held tight with clasps over a long period of time. So here we have remnants of the original tooled binding that have been repaired. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's a bit of a seam here, and I can tell that this has been repaired and strengthened in more modern times. And so this book is a processional. So processional is a type of book used in the liturgy and Christian religious services, and it's meant to include texts and chants that are pronounced during processions within a church, sometimes outside the church. And many of these survive, particularly like this one from a Dominican context. So from, in this case, a convent for nuns, but of the Dominican order. And so these manuscripts are usually quite compact because they were meant to be used, processed, taken around during particular specific processions within a monastery or within a church or in the immediate surroundings. So this is a book that was meant to be portable from the beginning, and they survive in quite large numbers because you would need a lot of them, because they are, though they might have been communally owned, they would have been it's sort of a one per monk or one per nun situation. So there are many that survive of this type, and many also from this period, the early 16th century, which is quite late in the history of manuscript liturgical books. But because these were sort of specific texts, as we'll see, needed in a specific convent or monastery, it was not generally useful to print these. It would not be worth setting up a whole print run. And so you have many of these later manuscript processionals that survive. And so this one was purchased, as I said, in 2008 by Penn Libraries. with the assistance of the Schoenberg-Bristol initiative for acquisitions. And these were manuscripts that were purchased, part purchased with internal funds, part purchased with the very generous donation of the Schoenberg family, in order to expand the scope of our collection at Penn and to include many different book types that perhaps were not present in the collection before. So I mentioned that this book has some interesting provenance, and when we open to the front paste down here, we can see Ex Libris Athelstan Riley of the year 1886 up here in Penn, and then a clipping from an auction catalog or a sales catalog, and it's pasted down. This is fairly typical as well. If you're a devotee of Coffee with a Codex, I'm sure you've encountered these before. This is a clipping. This was quite habitual that owners of books in the 19th and 20th centuries would paste in a clipping from the sale catalog from which they purchased the book. In quite a few cases now, it's possible to search the text here in these clippings and to find out what exact sale this book might have come from. Some people are real experts and can tell by the font or the layout of the little clipping what auction house or what dealer might have sold the manuscript. But I looked into this briefly before beginning today, and I could not figure that out. But perhaps someone else can. There are also some dealer codes here in pencil, so 20th century. So these are price codes. And again, there's a whole world. There are experts who are aficionados of price codes and could tell you perhaps which seller wrote those price codes. The point of price codes was to include within the book information so that the dealer could tell how much the book was priced for, or perhaps how much they purchased it for, but so that the buyer wouldn't immediately tell. So these are 10-letter keys to numbers. So they would spell out a 10-letter word would have that each it would be specific to each dealer, and that 10-letter word or phrase would have each of the letters would be equal to one of the numbers 0 through 9, and the price code would be encoded in that way. So some people can figure them out and get a sense of pricing in the book trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, predominantly in England, but also in America too. Then we have this wonderful book plate of Athelstan Riley. It says here, Seigneur de la Trinité, very grand name. Athelstan Riley was an important Anglo-Catholic composer, author, writer of hymns, translator. He had a very interesting, has a very interesting biography, and lived at 2 Kensington Court in West London, and he, again, composer of hymns. He purchased a manor in, you might be wondering why he's called Seigneur de la Trinité if he's an Anglo-Catholic from London, but he purchased a manor in Jersey in the Channel Islands of Trinity Manor, and so he acquired this sort of somewhat spurious pseudo-feudal title of Seigneur de la Trinité. We know he owned other rare books, and in the Schoenberg database of manuscripts, there are about 10 other items we know of from his collection. So he probably bought this, well, it has his signature up here and his Ex Libris and the date 1886. So purchased at a time of sort of Victorian interest in the medieval past, of which Athelstan Riley was an important proponent. The book was also been identified as having been sold at Sotheby's in 1965, possibly in 1926. But we don't have any other sort of 18th or 19th century provenance. But we do have, again, on one of the front fly leaves are some later annotations, and we have kind of listing in French of some of the contents of this manuscript, and also the name of Sœur Marie de Bourran, maybe. I also tried to look up this person. This is the probably early 17th century ownership mark. So this is the nun that this belonged to, and it tells you here the contents of this processional, and some later notated hymn, setting for a hymn here. The interesting thing about these processionals is that even ones like this from the 16th century now, I think we can tell on the basis of some of the texts that this is from the 16th century. But if you looked at it, it's quite a conservative script type. So it really looks like it's a manuscript that could be 100 years earlier. As you'll recall, there's that date on the spine of 1535, but that doesn't seem to refer to anything, at least that's still present in the manuscript. So that date might refer to something that has been lost, perhaps an older binding that had that date, or another inscription or flyleaf. And so it may well be that that date is correct, but we don't know based on any other evidence within the manuscript. And that there are other examples of that phenomenon of later dates being inscribed on bindings. Sometimes they're sort of, well, sometimes they're totally imaginary. We have a manuscript in Philadelphia from the 14th century that was brought to Philadelphia in the 18th century, and at that point it was rebound, and it was said to be from 1066, right? So this idea that it's from the date of the Norman conquest, and of course it's a much later manuscript. So that in some cases those dates are wishful thinking. So the book begins with the text for funeral service in the church, and also the commendation here. This begins with commendationes, the commendations, and burial. And so that takes up about 60 folios, 59 folios. And it includes, as you can see, some chants as well. And let me get to the end of that section. So this is the beginning. The sort of the section for funeral processions ends here at 59, and what's interesting here is that you have rubrics that are not always spelled out in a different color, written out in a different color. So here we have rubrics in French. So the text is in Latin, but you have rubrics in French, which is interesting. And some of them mention the members of the community, the nuns, les religieuses. And so that tells us a little bit about the community that owned the book. I'm trying to find one that's kind of interesting for us. So this is it's a little bit hard to see. The binding is a little bit tight on this book, so you might have to take my word for it. But here, this is the end this last word here, this amen up here, is the last word in Latin of this particular section of the liturgical text. And then après commence la chantre à haute voix l'antienne. So after this begins the singing out loud of the antiphon, Clementissime. This is the antiphon down here. As you can see, it's a Clementissime. And then the Miserere, and then tout here with the TTES ending. So that means that's in the feminine in French. Everyone, that means everyone, but meaning all the women, se met à genoux, go on their knees and say a series of prayers. So these are instructions, again, that are normally written in red, called rubrics, but here you can see they're in a slightly smaller script than the main text. That's how you can distinguish them, and they're in French as opposed to in Latin. Incidentally, down here we can see some marks. I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to carefully lift up the manuscript. Right at the bottom of the page here, and in the bottom right corner as well, I think you can see these little remnants of signatures or catchwords. I think signatures. These are alphanumerical little codes that assisted in binding the book, and then were often trimmed off. You can see another one here. And so just a little bit of evidence of how the book was produced. And of course, the text block was trimmed down probably initially when the book was bound, but also when this binding perhaps was repaired, perhaps it was trimmed again. And you can see nice examples of the pricking marks here. And I'm sure, again, you've seen those quite a lot if you're a habitué of this program, if you come and watch Coffee with a Codex other weeks as well. So that's the funeral service that ends, and then we have processions with these chants for important feasts of the liturgical year. So Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Easter, Ascension, Corpus Christi, Assumption, Purification, etc. And those continue for another 70 or 80 folios, as you can see. And there are processionals, some of them are a little bit earlier than this one, from the 15th century, that are interesting because they may have been produced by nuns, as opposed to produced in a commercial workshops in cities. I'm not sure if we know, for an example like this, or if anyone has studied that particular phenomenon with these types of processionals. And also processionals, because these texts varied a little bit by institution, it would probably, in theory, be possible to localize, if one studied this in great deal of depth, to localize for what convent or institution this book was made, even if that early 17th century owner, that sister Maria de Bouron, is probably not identifiable. That's not a distinctive enough name, perhaps, to find. Perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps there could be a discovery made about that individual. But often when we have names like that in these books, if the name is, well, first of all, Maria is by far the most common name for a nun, certainly in Western Europe. If we have kind of generic names, it can be difficult to locate that individual historically in other documents, although it may be possible. I'm pausing here because I don't know if you can see overhead, but of course this manuscript is on parchment, but there's an interesting repair here. I hope you can see that. That looks like, on the left, two patches of paper that has been, I think the term is feathered, so it's been thinned out and glued onto the parchment. It's hard to tell, but perhaps immediately after, when the book was made, if an error was noticed, or perhaps shortly after the book was made. There's another such patch repair here. And this is on the musical, on the stave lines, right? So this is on part of the musical notation that was erroneous. There must have been notes there that were that shouldn't have been there, and so that has been repaired fairly subtly, but again, hard to know when that was done. I would imagine fairly soon after the book was made, but not immediately when it was made. Perhaps when it was used for the first time, and the person singing the chant realized that they were singing out of sync with the rest of the celebrants, and so decided that they had to repair this portion of the musical notation. But that's an interesting, I've never seen that exact type of patch repair before. You can also see here we have some notes that are rubbed out, and that appears to have been done. Again, it's hard to tell, but sometimes looking very closely, I hope you can see on the two final lines, there are some corrections. So notes have been scraped off. And of course, with parchment, this is fairly robust parchment. That's fairly easy to do. So perhaps that was done when the book was being made, as opposed to those patches which were done afterwards. And here, again, a rubric starts in red, tout à genoux, en la dernière station, excepté celle qui porte la croix et les cierges, comment la chantre disent cette antienne. So everyone on their knees, and at this the last station, meaning the last sort of place where you stop within the church in the procession, except those who are carrying the cross. Of course, if you're carrying a processional cross, you can't really get on your knees very easily. So this is a little bit of stage direction for this liturgical ceremony, except for those holding the cross and les cierges, which is cierge, that means the candles. Again, if you're holding a candle, it's sort of hard to genuflect. That's the official term for kneeling in a church context. I will post the link in a moment. I'm not quite as adept as my colleague Dot at doing that while remembering to do that. So I will post the link. But this is MS Codex 1229 if you want to look it up in our Franklin catalog. So it's a book that, of course, has no illumination or no gilding, no miniatures, but it's interesting in the sense that these, particularly these rubrics in French, give you an interesting window into the life of a community of female religious in France in the early 16th century. There's a question about whether we know which area from France it comes from, and I don't know offhand. I don't know if anyone else has looked into this, but I would say that that word we just saw for candles, cierge with a CH, it's usually not spelt with a CH, would probably give someone who's an expert in French kind of regional dialects or regional spellings, that would probably give an indication. I think that is more of a Northern French phenomenon. And so if I would guess, I would say this is probably from Northern France, so sort of the northern kind of quadrant, more or less. It's not very helpful because many manuscripts come from that area, but that would be my guess without having done a very thorough investigation. So let's get to the section for example, for Good Friday. And you can see some of the initials here in this portion of the manuscript become a little bit more elaborate. They're not really anthropomorphic. They don't have figures, but they have more sort of vegetal forms, which are kind of interesting. Let's see. So this is what the priest says, le levant la croix nue en haut dit. So the priest raising up the cross on its own says, and then it's a prayer to the wood of the cross. So this is around Eastertide, I believe. And then the day of the Ascension, this procession here, and the hymns for that procession. Again, some corrections here. I hope you can see to the musical notation that's been rubbed out, and the staff lines have been redrawn over them. So it would be interesting. I mean, you could do a very, very close study of the musical notation and try to understand why that change might have occurred. And I think it must be related to, wanting to fit in with what other people's processionals at that institution had. There could have been some reason why the musical setting was slightly different, and they had to kind of sort it out. And they decided, okay, the people who have this musical notation in this variant, keep it, and this other variant, cross it out and rewrite it. So it's interesting to speculate on some of that. And then at the end towards the end of the manuscript, we have, starting here on folio 139, we have the 7 penitential psalms, which I guess it's sort of perhaps interesting to find them here, but these were very commonly recited psalms. You'll be familiar with them from many books of hours, if you've seen books of hours before on Coffee with a Codex. And these are 7 of the 150 psalms from the Hebrew Bible, of course translated into Latin, that were particularly suited towards penitence, so asking for forgiveness from God. And so here they are written out without any musical notation. And then the book ends, and we have some clearly non-professionally written musical notation for a hymn. And then we have blank verso that's quite worn, which indicates to me at least that this is really the end of the book and we're not missing anything. And we have these modern kind of brown paper fly leaves as we do at the front. And I would imagine that those were added in 1886 when the manuscript was perhaps purchased by Athelstan Riley. So it's just about 12:30. I wonder if there are any questions anyone wants to ask in the chat. And if not, I'll give you one last look at the binding. You can see that there's it's quite damaged, but there's some remnants of gilt tooling as well as the blind tooling around the edges. And thank you for your time and attention and for spending the first half hour of your afternoon with me looking at MS Codex 1229.